The chandeliers of the Elysium Grand Ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, scattering golden light across polished marble floors and silk gowns that whispered as their owners moved. Diamonds caught the glow. Champagne glasses chimed softly. Every detail of the room existed for one purpose: to display wealth without ever naming it. This wasn't just a charity ball. It was a hierarchy. And Jose Williams walked into it like a man who believed the rankings had already been decided. At 34, Jose had reached a level most people only dreamed of. His tech empire had risen fast, built on ruthless efficiency, sharp instincts, and an unshakable belief that success belonged to those bold enough to take it. His name opened doors. His presence changed rooms. Tonight, the tailored black tuxedo hugged him perfectly. His watch glinted under the chandelier light, custom, understated, expensive in a way that didn't beg for attention. Jose didn't need to prove anything. He already knew where he stood. He scanned the ballroom with the practiced ease of someone used to being admired. Investors nodded in his direction. A senator smiled too widely. A well-known venture capitalist raised a glass in acknowledgement. Jose returned each gesture casually, as if he were doing them a favor simply by existing in the same space. This was his element. Charity balls were never really about charity, not to people like him. They were about visibility, influence, strategic generosity that paid dividends later. Jose reached for a flute of champagne from a passing tray and lifted it just enough to signal approval. He took a slow sip, savoring the taste, when something caught his eye. Someone who didn't fit. She stood near the champagne table, slightly removed from the clusters of conversation that dominated the room. She wasn't trying to insert herself into anyone's circle. She wasn't checking her phone or scanning the crowd nervously. She was simply standing there, calm, still, observant. And her dress. Jose narrowed his eyes. It wasn't ugly. That wasn't the problem. It was neat, modest, and clearly well cared for. But in a room overflowing with designer labels, plunging necklines, and gowns that screamed status, her dress was quiet. Vintage. A soft red and white pattern, tailored but simple. No glitter. No dramatic flair. Almost defiant in its understatement. It looked like it belonged to another era. Jose felt a smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. "Well," he murmured under his breath, turning slightly so his words would carry. "That's unexpected." A few nearby guests glanced in the same direction, curiosity sparking as they followed his gaze. "She looks lost," someone whispered. Jose chuckled, lowering his glass. Lost might be generous. He stepped closer, timing it perfectly close enough that his voice would be heard, but not so close that he'd seem aggressive. Just confident. Just amused. "Loud enough for a small audience," he said. "Is this a charity ball, or did we accidentally wander into a history exhibit?" A ripple of laughter followed. The woman turned slowly. She didn't flinch, didn't blush, didn't rush to explain herself. Her brown hair was pulled back neatly. No flashy jewelry, no exaggerated makeup. Her expression was composed, almost unreadable, as her eyes met Jose's. For a brief moment, something passed between them, something he couldn't immediately define. Then she spoke. "It's vintage," she said calmly. Her voice was steady, polite, unbothered. Jose laughed softly, shaking his head. "Vintage doesn't automatically mean appropriate. You sure you weren't meant to be backstage?" This time, the laughter was louder. A few heads turned. Someone nearby snorted into their drink. Jose felt that familiar rush, the same one he got during high-stakes negotiations, when he knew he had the upper hand. Control, dominance, approval. The woman studied him for a second longer. There was no anger in her eyes, no embarrassment, just a quiet, assessing look, as if she were committing his face to memory. Then she smiled. Not warmly, not sarcastically, just politely. She took a sip of her champagne and walked away without another word. The moment passed. Jose watched her go, feeling satisfied. He lifted his glass again, dismissing the interaction as inconsequential. Another forgettable encounter in a night full of them. He didn't know that moment would soon be replayed millions of times. If this story already has you hooked, like this video, Subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. It helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this. The ballroom lights dimmed. A hush rolled through the room, conversations dissolving into expectant silence as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. The microphone crackled softly before the voice filled the space. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight in support of a cause that changes lives. Jose suppressed a yawn. This was always the dull part. Tonight, the host continued, we have the honor of recognizing an extraordinary benefactor, a woman whose generosity will directly impact thousands of families. Polite applause followed. Jose took another sip of champagne, half listening. A donation, the voice continued, of $5 million. The room erupted. Jose straightened slightly. Interest piqued despite himself. $5 million wasn't pocket change, not even in rooms like this. Well, he muttered, whoever it is clearly wanted attention. The host paused, letting the anticipation stretch. Please welcome to the stage, Carolyn Harrison. Heir to the Harrison Group. The world seemed to tilt. Jose's hand loosened around the stem of his glass. He watched, frozen, as the woman in the vintage dress stepped into the spotlight. The same dress. The same calm posture. The same composed expression. Applause thundered, people stood. Phones lifted. Cameras flashed in rapid succession. Jose's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound swallowed instantly by the roar of admiration. Carolyn Harrison. The name echoed in his head like a verdict. The Harrison Group wasn't just wealthy, it was legacy power. Old money. Quiet influence that shaped markets without ever needing to announce itself. Entire industries bent around their decisions. Carolyn smiled as she approached the microphone. My grandmother taught me something very early in life, she said gently, resting her fingers against the fabric of her dress. That wealth isn't measured by what we wear, but by what we give. The room fell silent. This dress belonged to her, Carolyn continued. She wore it on the night she met the love of her life. I wear it tonight to honor the values she passed down to me. Her eyes lifted briefly and found Jose. There was no anger in them. Only distance. Finality. Applause surged again, louder than before. Some guests wiped away tears. Others nodded solemnly. Jose couldn't breathe. He felt small. For the first time in years, truly small. Carolyn stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded politicians, executives, celebrities, all eager for a moment with the woman who had just donated $5 million. Jose stood rooted to the spot, watching her disappear into admiration. He knew two things with chilling clarity. First, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Second, and far more terrifying, the consequences were only beginning. The applause did not fade. It swelled layer upon layer until the sound filled every corner of the Elysium Grand Ballroom and pressed against Jose Williams's chest like a physical force. People rose to their feet as if pulled by a single invisible string. Chairs scraped back. Hands clapped until palms reddened. The room had chosen its moment, and it was not his. Carolyn Harrison stood beneath the chandeliers, the same vintage dress catching the light in a way Jose hadn't noticed before. Under the glare of cameras and crystal, it wasn't modest anymore. It was luminous. It didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. Jose's breath came shallow. He watched her take the microphone, watched the ease with which she held it, as though she'd been born knowing exactly how to stand when the world turned its eyes toward her. She waited just long enough for the applause to crest and begin its descent. Silence followed, thick and reverent. My grandmother used to say, Carolyn began, her voice carrying without effort, that wealth isn't proven by what we wear or what we own. She paused, letting the words settle. It's proven by what we give, especially when no one is watching. The crowd leaned in. Carolyn's fingers brushed the fabric at her waist, a simple, unconscious gesture that somehow anchored the entire room to the dress Jose had mocked minutes earlier. This dress belonged to her, she continued. She wore it the night she met the love of her life. She wore it when she believed the future could be kind. A murmur rippled through the audience, soft, approving, emotional. I wear it tonight, Carolyn said, to honor her memory. And to remind myself that no amount of money should ever erase where we come from. The applause returned, louder than before. José's champagne glass slipped from his hand. It hit the marble floor and shattered, the sharp crack swallowed instantly by clapping hands and cheers. He didn't move. He couldn't. His fingers tingled as if they'd gone numb, and the room tilted slightly, like a ship taking on water. Carolyn Harrison. The name echoed in his head, each syllable heavier than the last. Harrison Group, the family whose investments shaped markets before José had even launched his first startup. Old money. Quiet money. The kind that didn't posture because it didn't need to. He had laughed at her dress. He swallowed hard, tasting bile. Carolyn's eyes lifted as she finished speaking, scanning the sea of faces with a calm that bordered on detached. When her gaze reached José, it stopped only for a second. There was no anger there, no triumph. Just distance. The applause thundered again, and she smiled for the crowd, stepped back from the microphone, and descended the stage steps into a storm of admirers. Executives surged forward. A senator leaned in to shake her hand. Someone called her name with reverence, as though it were a title. José stood frozen at the edge of it all. José, someone whispered beside him. Do you know who that is? He nodded without looking. His jaw ached from how tightly he was clenching it. He knew. God, he knew. The room had shifted, not subtly, not gradually. Completely. Where he'd once been a gravitational force, people now orbited around her. The laughter he'd sparked earlier curdled in his memory, sour and loud. He could feel eyes flicking toward him, curious, knowing, sharp. He had to do something. He straightened his jacket, wiped his palms discreetly against his trousers, and moved. Each step toward Carolyn felt heavier than the last, as though the marble floor had turned to wet cement beneath his shoes. He waited at the edge of the crowd, rehearsing words that suddenly felt thin and useless. I'm sorry. I didn't know. It was a joke. None of them sounded right. The circle around Carolyn tightened, then loosened. José saw an opening and took it, stepping forward with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Harrison, he said, his voice coming out lower than he expected. I wanted to apologize. Carolyn turned her head slightly. She looked at him the way one might look at an object that had briefly caught their attention and already lost it. Her gaze traveled over him without interest, then moved past him entirely. She said nothing. José felt heat flood his face. I was out of line, he continued, pushing through the tightening in his chest. I made an assumption. And, excuse me, Carolyn said, still not looking at him. Her tone was polite, controlled, sharp as a blade. I'm in the middle of a conversation. The words landed quietly. They cut anyway. A man standing beside her, someone José vaguely recognized from a boardroom he'd once coveted, raised an eyebrow at José, lips curving in a faint, knowing smile. The message was clear. You don't belong here. José stepped back. The crowd closed again, sealing Carolyn off as if he'd never been there at all. Laughter bubbled up from somewhere inside the circle. A camera flashed. Someone touched Carolyn's arm familiarly, and she smiled for them, warm and engaged. She didn't look back. José stood there, hands hanging uselessly at his sides, while the room continued without him. The music resumed, soft and elegant, as if nothing remarkable had happened. Except everything had. He noticed the phones then. Dozens of them, raised at different angles. Screens glowing, red recording dots blinking. People weren't just watching anymore, they were documenting, capturing, preserving. Every word he'd said earlier. Every laugh. Every glance. A chill crept down his spine. He turned slowly, scanning the ballroom, and realized with growing horror that the moment hadn't belonged to him at all. It belonged to the internet now, to strangers who would pause and rewind and dissect. He imagined the captions already forming. Billionaire mocks Harris. Ego meets real power. Vintage dress, priceless lesson. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Once. Twice. Again. He didn't check it. Across the room, Carolyn moved like royalty. accepting praise with quiet grace. She shook hands. She listened. She laughed softly at something a woman whispered into her ear. The dress seemed to glow as she passed beneath the chandeliers, no longer an oddity but a statement. Jose saw it then, with painful clarity. The dress hadn't been out of place. He had. He took a step back, then another, until he reached the edge of the ballroom. From there, he watched as Carolyn disappeared deeper into the crowd, swallowed by admiration and influence that dwarfed his own. The power had shifted. Permanently. The music swelled, glasses clinked, conversations resumed, animated and excited, as though the night had just begun. Jose felt detached from it all, like a man watching a party through thick glass. He knew he would never forget this moment. Not the sound of applause. Not the way her eyes had passed over him. Not the silence that followed his apology. As he turned away, heading for the exit, he caught one last glimpse of Carolyn Harrison surrounded, smiling, untouchable. And for the first time since he'd built his empire, Jose Williams understood what it felt like to lose control. Behind him, the cameras kept rolling, and the consequences were only just beginning. Jose Williams did not sleep. When he finally gave up and opened his eyes, dawn had already begun to thin the darkness beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. The city lay below him in a pale wash of gray and gold, unfamiliar and distant, like a place he no longer belonged to. His phone lay on the nightstand, face down. He knew what waited on the other side of that black screen. He could feel it humming, vibrating softly every few seconds like a living thing. Messages. Alerts. Notifications piling on top of one another. Jose exhaled slowly and reached for it. The screen lit up. 47 unread messages. Most of them were from people who had never dared to message him this early before. Assistants. Partners. A few numbers he didn't recognize at all. At the top of the list, his assistant's name blinked insistently, followed by a string of missed calls. Jose tapped into his social media feed. The first video loaded before he even finished scrolling. It was him, standing beneath the chandeliers of the Elysium Grand Ballroom, smiling. Confident. Loud enough for the microphone to catch every word. Is this a charity ball or a history exhibit? The clip cut sharply to Carolyn Harrison walking onto the stage in the same dress, applause crashing over the room like a wave. The camera zoomed in on his face, pale, stunned, mouth slightly open. The view count ticked upward in real time. 2.8 million views. Jose dropped the phone onto the bed as if it had burned him. His chest tightened, and he dragged in a breath that didn't quite reach his lungs. He pressed his palms against his eyes, but the images replayed anyway. The laughter. The silence. The way Carolyn had looked through him like he wasn't even worth the effort of contempt. The phone buzzed again. He forced himself to answer it this time. Jose, his assistant said, voice strained. You need to see the news. I've seen enough, he muttered. No, she replied. This is bigger. He opened his laptop. The headline stared back at him, merciless and bold. Billionaire humiliates Harrison heiress at charity ball. When arrogance meets real power. Vintage dress. Modern lesson. His name appeared in every article, linked and tagged and dissected. Opinion pieces followed within hours, each one sharper than the last. A business magazine he'd once graced the cover of now called him a case study in unchecked ego. Jose slammed the laptop shut. Unbelievable, he snapped, pacing the length of the room. They don't know me. They don't know anything. He told himself it would blow over. Viral moments always did. The internet moved fast, chewed people up, and spat them out for the next scandal. This would pass. It had to. His phone rang again. This time, it was one of his investors. Jose straightened, schooling his voice into something calm as he answered, "Morning." There was no greeting on the other end. "We're putting things on hold," the man said bluntly, "until this settles." "On hold?" Jose repeated. "We're days away from finalizing." "Public perception matters," the investor cut in. "And right now yours is toxic." The line went dead. Jose stared at the phone in disbelief. Another call came in almost immediately. then another. Each one followed the same pattern: carefully worded concern, thinly veiled discomfort, and finally, distance. Meetings were postponed, dinners canceled, a conference appearance quietly removed from the schedule. By noon, his calendar looked like a battlefield after retreat. Empty. He sank onto the edge of the couch, running a hand through his hair. Anger flared hot and fast, burning through the shock. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to the empty room. "All of this over a joke." A joke. The word sounded hollow even to him. His phone buzzed again. This time, the message made his stomach drop. Harrison Foundation meeting suspended until further notice. Jose read it twice, 3 times. The Harrison Foundation had been the cornerstone of his next expansion phase, not just funding credibility. Access. The kind of endorsement that opened doors worldwide. And Carolyn Harrison sat on its board. His chest tightened painfully. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He stood abruptly, knocking over a decorative chair. It crashed to the floor, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet penthouse. Jose barely noticed. Denial gave way to panic. He opened his email, refreshing obsessively, hoping for a correction. A clarification. Anything. Nothing came. Instead, another article appeared. Harrison Group distances itself from controversial tech CEO. Jose closed his eyes. For the first time since he'd built his empire, he felt the ground shifting beneath him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By evening, the anger had burned itself out, leaving something worse behind. Shame. He sat alone at his kitchen island, untouched food growing cold in front of him, scrolling through comments he knew he shouldn't read and couldn't stop reading anyway. He thought money made him better than everyone else. That dress had more class than he ever will. She didn't even have to say anything. Iconic. Jose swallowed hard. He replayed the moment again in his mind, not the mockery, but what came after. Carolyn's silence. The way she'd walked away without raising her voice, without defending herself. She hadn't needed to. The power imbalance he'd relied on had never existed. The realization hit him slowly, then all at once. This wasn't just about a bad joke. It was about who he'd become. The phone vibrated again, snapping him out of his thoughts. This time, it wasn't a call. It was an email. From Harrison Group Executive Office. Subject: Meeting Request. Jose's heart pounded as he opened it. "Dear Mr. Williams, we would like to invite you to a formal meeting at Harrison Group headquarters. Please confirm your availability." No tone, no explanation, no reassurance. Just an address, a time. Jose stared at the screen for a long moment. The city lights outside flickered on, one by one, illuminating the glass and steel world he'd once thought he controlled. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone, cut off from the alliances and admiration that had defined him. He didn't know whether the meeting was an opportunity or a reckoning. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore it. If you're enjoying this story, like, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. It helps us keep these stories coming. Jose closed the laptop and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. The internet had judged him. The business world had turned its back. And somewhere in the city, Carolyn Harrison was deciding whether he deserved even a single chance to explain himself. For the first time in years, Jose Williams wasn't in control of the narrative. And the silence was deafening. The Harrison Group headquarters rose from the city like a statement rather than a building. Glass and steel, clean lines, no excess. Power without ornament. Jose Williams stood across the street for a moment longer than necessary, staring up at the discreet logo etched into the facade. There were no banners, no flashing screens, no need to announce dominance. The Harrison Group didn't compete for attention. It assumed it. Jose adjusted his tie for the 3rd time and crossed the street. The revolving doors swallowed him whole, ushering him into a lobby that smelled faintly of polished stone and restraint. A receptionist greeted him with a professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Williams," she said, glancing at her screen. "They're expecting you." Not she. That alone tightened something in his chest. He followed her down a corridor lined with abstract art and framed photographs, groundbreakings, humanitarian projects, schools, hospitals. Carolyn Harrison appeared in a few of them, always slightly off-center, never the focal point. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent. When the doors opened, the boardroom awaited. It was vast, cool, and meticulously ordered. A long table of dark wood stretched across the room, its surface empty except for neatly arranged folders and glasses of water. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city below, distant and small, as if reminding anyone inside that height changed perspective. Carolyn Harrison sat at the head of the table. She wore a tailored gray blazer, crisp and understated, her hair pulled back with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. Reading glasses rested on her nose as she flipped through a folder, expression focused, unreadable. She didn't look up immediately. Jose hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Miss Harrison." Carolyn lifted her gaze slowly, removing her glasses and setting them down with deliberate care. "Mr. Williams," she said. "You're punctual. I appreciate that." Her tone was polite, neutral. Colder than anger. "Please," she added, gesturing to a chair halfway down the table. "Have a seat." Jose sat, the leather chair suddenly feeling far less comfortable than it looked. He folded his hands together to keep them from shaking. Carolyn closed the folder and regarded him for a long moment. The silence stretched, heavy and intentional. "Let's be direct," she said at last. "We reviewed your proposal." Jose straightened slightly. "Thank you. I believe our technology could make a significant impact." "It could," Carolyn interrupted gently. "Your numbers are impressive. Your innovation is strong. On paper, your company is exactly the kind of organization foundations like ours are meant to support." A flicker of relief sparked in Jose's chest. Then she continued. "However," she said, opening a different folder, "we don't invest in paper." She slid the folder across the table toward him. "We invest in people, in culture, in values." Jose's throat tightened as he opened it. Inside were printed reports, internal surveys, anonymous complaints. Carolyn spoke calmly as he read. "In the last 6 months," she said, "we've received multiple concerns regarding your company's internal environment. Allegations of inappropriate jokes, dismissive leadership, a pattern of behavior that discourages dissent." Jose looked up. "Those reports were exaggerated. We addressed." "You ignored them," Carolyn said softly. The words landed with surgical precision. "You labeled them as overreactions," she continued. "You told your board they were distractions. You prioritized productivity over people." Jose felt heat creep up his neck. "That's not fair. I built that company from nothing. I demand excellence." "So did my grandfather," Carolyn replied. "He just never confused excellence with humiliation." The room fell silent again. Jose swallowed. "Miss Harrison." "About the charity ball. I was wrong. Completely. What I said was, unforgivable?" she asked calmly. He blinked. "Yes." Carolyn tilted her head slightly. "Is it?" Jose hesitated. I don't understand." She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands loosely in front of her. "Mr. Williams, I'm not interested in rehearsed remorse. I'm interested in understanding." Her eyes held his now, steady and intent. "Why did you say it?" The question caught him off guard. "I was arrogant," he said quickly. "I judged by appearance." "Yes," she agreed. "That's the behavior. I'm asking about the cause." Jose opened his mouth, then closed it. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. Carolyn studied him, not unkindly, but without sympathy either. "Then that," she said, "is the problem." She stood and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind her back as she looked out over the city. "When someone feels the need to humiliate another person publicly," she continued, "it's rarely about superiority. It's about fear." Jose frowned. "Fear?" "Of being overlooked," she said, "of being insignificant, of being reminded of something you'd rather forget." Her words struck closer than he expected. She turned back to face him. "Until you understand what drives you to assert dominance at someone else's expense, no apology you offer will be real. It will just be noise." Jose's chest felt tight, his thoughts scrambling. I want to fix this, he said. I can do better. I will do better. Carolyn considered him for a long moment. Everyone deserves the opportunity to change, she said at last. But change isn't something you ask for. She picked up her glasses and slid them back on. It's something you prove. She returned to her seat and slid a single document across the table. We're postponing any decision regarding your proposal, she said. 30 days. Jose stared at the paper. 30 days. To do what? To reflect, Carolyn replied. To examine your leadership, your culture, yourself. No forgiveness, she added calmly. No investment. No public reconciliation. Jose looked up, pulse racing. And after 30 days? Carolyn met his gaze. That depends entirely on what you discover. The meeting was over. She stood, signaling the end without raising her voice. You may go, Mr. Williams. Jose rose slowly, his legs unsteady. As he reached the door, he hesitated. Miss Harrison. She paused. The dress, he said quietly, not turning around. It was your grandmother's. Yes, she replied. It was beautiful, he said. I was wrong. For the first time, something in her expression softened just slightly. You can go now, Carolyn said. The door closed behind him with a soft final click. Jose stood in the hallway, staring at his reflection in the polished glass. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. When the doors opened into the lobby, the city rushed back in noise, movement, indifference. Jose stepped outside, the weight of the building still pressing against his chest. 30 days. He had entered the Harrison Group headquarters, believing he could salvage his reputation. He left, realizing something far more unsettling. For the first time in his life, Jose Williams wasn't being judged by what he'd built, but by who he was. And he wasn't sure he liked the answer. Jose Williams drove without music. The silence inside the car felt deliberate, as if sound itself would be a distraction he couldn't afford. The city thinned as he moved farther from glass towers and manicured streets, replaced by narrower roads and buildings that leaned a little closer together. The navigation system announced turns he already knew by heart. He hadn't been here in years. Not since the money came. Not since escape became success. The neighborhood appeared smaller than he remembered, less intimidating, less sharp, but the familiarity settled into his chest with a weight that surprised him. The corner store was still there, its faded sign crooked but stubbornly intact. The basketball court still bore the same cracked paint. A group of kids played nearby, laughter echoing off brick walls that had once felt like barriers instead of shelter. Jose parked and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. He told himself he was here to think. But the truth pressed closer. He was here because Carolyn Harrison's question wouldn't leave him alone. Why did you say it? He stepped out of the car. The air smelled different here, oil and dust and something faintly sweet drifting from an open window. He walked slowly, unsure where he was going until his feet carried him to a familiar building, its brick exterior weathered but standing. Apartment 17. He hesitated before knocking. The door opened almost immediately. Jose? A woman said, eyes widening. Jose Williams? He recognized her voice before her face fully registered. Mrs. Alvarez. She'd lived down the hall when he was a child, the kind of neighbor who noticed when his mother worked late and made sure he'd eaten something warm. It's me, he said quietly. She laughed, covering her mouth. Look at you. All grown up. Then, more softly, you disappeared. I got busy, he replied. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. The apartment smelled like simmering spices and old books. Time had rearranged the furniture, but not the feeling small, warm, alive. Jose sat at the kitchen table while Mrs. Alvarez poured tea, her movements unhurried. So, she said, placing the mug in front of him, what brings you back? Jose stared at the steam rising from the cup. I made a mistake, he said. A public one. She raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. I said something cruel, he continued, to someone who didn't deserve it, and now I'm trying to understand why. Mrs. Alvarez nodded slowly. You were always hard on yourself, she said. Harder on others, sometimes. The words stung because they were true. He left soon after, walking the block with memories pressing in from every direction. He remembered the sneakers, the first expensive pair he'd ever owned, donated through a school program. How proud he'd been. How careful. How he'd stopped playing with Tommy because Tommy's shoes had holes in them. He remembered the laughter, the fear of being laughed at again. He remembered promising himself he'd never be that boy. Somewhere along the way, he'd confused survival with superiority. The realization settled slowly, painfully. He hadn't mocked Carolyn Harrison because of her dress. He'd mocked her because it reminded him of a version of himself he'd buried and refused to mourn. By the time he returned to his car, the sun had begun its descent, painting the neighborhood in long shadows. Jose sat behind the wheel and let his head fall back against the seat. I became them, he whispered. The people who'd laughed, the people who'd looked down. He drove home differently than he'd arrived, quieter, heavier, more aware of the distance between who he was and who he'd been. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for something he hadn't paid attention to before. Carolyn Harrison. Not the headlines. Not the viral clips. The footnotes. He found them everywhere once he knew where to look. Small mentions in local papers. Grants announced without fanfare. Community centers funded quietly. Scholarships that didn't bear her name. She didn't attach her image to the work. She let the work stand on its own. Jose leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. One project caught his attention, a modest community center on the east side of the city. No press photos, no gala dinners, just programs, meals, classes, safe spaces. Funded by the Harrison Foundation. He checked the schedule. Open hours. Volunteer shifts. No appointment required. Jose closed the laptop. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. The next morning, he dressed simply, no tailored suit, no statement watch. He drove across the city again, this time toward a building that looked nothing like the headquarters he'd stood in days earlier. The community center was smaller than he expected. Brick exterior. Hand-painted sign. Children's drawings taped to the windows. He parked across the street and sat there longer than necessary. This wasn't a boardroom. There was no script. No leverage. He crossed the street and pushed open the door. The sounds hit him first: voices, laughter, movement. The smell of food, the hum of something alive and imperfect. Jose stepped inside. Unannounced. And for the first time since his empire began to crumble, he didn't feel the need to pretend he belonged. He just stood there waiting to find out who he was becoming. Jose Williams learned very quickly that money meant nothing inside the community center. No one asked who he was. No one cared what he owned. No one even noticed the car he'd parked outside. The moment he stepped fully into the building, he became just another adult standing awkwardly near the entrance, unsure where to put his hands. Can I help you? A woman asked, glancing up from a clipboard. Jose cleared his throat. I'm here to volunteer. She studied him for half a second, then smiled. Great. We always need extra hands. Kitchen's that way. Ask for Marta. That was it. No recognition. No hesitation. No reverence. Jose nodded and followed the direction, feeling strangely exposed without the armor of importance he'd worn for years. The kitchen was warm and loud, pots clanged. Someone laughed. A radio played softly in the corner. Marta, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried, pointed him toward a stack of vegetables. Wash and chop, she said. Careful with your fingers. Jose stared at the knife like it might bite him. He'd negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He'd fired executives without blinking. And yet, 10 minutes later, he was bleeding. Seriously? A kid's voice said. Jose looked up to see a boy of maybe 10 watching him from the doorway, arms crossed, unimpressed. You don't know how to cut onions? Jose grimaced. I'm learning. The boy snorted. My grandma's better than you, and she's 80. A ripple of laughter followed from somewhere behind him. Jose felt his ears burn. Give him a break, Marta said dryly. Not everyone grows up in a kitchen. Jose almost laughed at that. By mid-morning, he had managed to ruin 2 cutting boards, burn a pot of rice, and stack chairs the wrong way twice. Each mistake was met with commentary. You're doing it backwards. That's not how mops work. Are you sure you've ever cleaned anything before? He didn't argue. For once, he didn't try to take control. He listened. Somewhere between sweeping the floor and handing out juice boxes, he felt something loosen inside him. The constant need to prove himself. The reflex to dominate. Here, none of that mattered. And then he saw her. Carolyn stood near the far wall, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, laughing softly as she knelt beside a little girl struggling with her shoelaces. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, no makeup, no jewelry beyond a thin chain at her neck. She looked ordinary. And somehow, that made her more striking than she'd been under chandeliers and flashing cameras. Jose froze. She hadn't noticed him yet. He watched her for a moment, the ease with which she moved through the space unmistakable. She didn't direct. She didn't command. She joined, listened, adjusted herself to the rhythm of the room rather than bending it to her will. When she finally looked up and saw him, there was no shock in her expression. Only curiosity. She didn't approach him. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply watched. Jose returned to scrubbing tables, acutely aware of every movement he made. He wasn't here to explain himself. He wasn't here to apologize again. He was here to work. The children didn't give him time to overthink it. "Hey," a girl said, tugging at his sleeve. "You missed a spot." He glanced down. She was right. "Thanks," he said. She frowned at him suspiciously. "You talk weird." Jose smiled despite himself. "I get that a lot." By lunchtime, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with long hours or high stakes. This was a different kind of tired, earned, physical, honest. He wiped his hands on a towel and turned, and found Carolyn standing beside him. "Still here," she said. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just observant. "I said I wanted to help," Jose replied. This seemed like a good place to start. She studied him, eyes thoughtful. "You're not very good at it." He huffed out a quiet laugh. "I've noticed." A pause settled between them, not awkward but cautious. "Why?" she asked. He met her gaze. "Because you told me to find out why I am the way I am. I figured I should start somewhere that doesn't care who I pretend to be." That earned him the faintest lift of her lips. The rest of the afternoon passed in small moments. Jose carried boxes. He listened to stories. He got corrected often. Each time, he accepted it without defensiveness, surprising even himself. Carolyn said little, but she stayed nearby, watching. When the last child left and the room quieted, Jose wiped down a table for the 3rd time, more out of habit than necessity. "You don't have to do that," Carolyn said. He shrugged. "It still feels unfinished." She considered him for a moment, then nodded toward the door. "Walk with me." They stepped outside into the cooling air. The city hummed around them, distant and indifferent. "You didn't have to come here," she said. "I know. And you didn't have to stay." "I know that too." She stopped walking and faced him fully. "This doesn't change what happened. I'm not asking it to." Another pause. "You're uncomfortable," she observed. "Yes." "Good," she said simply. Jose blinked. "Good?" "Discomfort is honest," Carolyn replied. "It means you're not hiding." He absorbed that quietly. They stood there for a moment longer, the space between them filled with things neither was ready to say. "I'll be back tomorrow," Jose said, more statement than question. Carolyn studied him, weighing something unseen. "Tomorrow's usually busier," she said. "If you can handle that." "I can handle it." She nodded once. "We'll see." As she turned to leave, Jose realized something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly but enough to matter. For the first time since the ballroom, Carolyn Harrison had not looked at him with distance. She had looked at him with curiosity, and that felt like the beginning of something he hadn't earned yet but might, if he kept showing up. Jose watched her go, then turned back toward the center. Tomorrow, he would return. Not as a billionaire. Not as an apology, but as a man learning how to be smaller and discovering, to his surprise, that it felt like growth. The morning began like any other. Jose arrived early, sleeves already rolled up, the faint scent of cleaning solution still clinging to his hands from the night before. He didn't check his phone. He didn't scan the room for recognition. He simply stepped inside the community center and waited to be told what to do. That, more than anything, told him he was changing. "Hey, knife guy," a familiar voice called out. Jose turned to see the same boy from earlier in the week leaning against a doorway, smirk firmly in place. "You gonna hurt the vegetables again today?" Jose smiled. "I've improved." The boy snorted. "We'll see." Laughter rippled through the room, light and unguarded. Jose took his place at the back, stacking boxes of donated supplies while the center slowly filled with life children's voices, the scrape of chairs, the hum of preparation. Carolyn arrived not long after. She moved through the space with the same quiet presence she always carried, checking in with volunteers, kneeling to listen to a child describe a drawing with exaggerated seriousness. When she noticed Jose, she gave a small nod. Nothing more. It was enough. By late morning, the center buzzed with activity. A group of children gathered near the side yard, where construction had been underway to expand the building, new classrooms, a larger kitchen, space that would soon be filled with more noise, more life. Temporary scaffolding stood along the exterior wall, metal bars bolted together hastily in the rush to meet a deadline. Jose noticed it because it didn't feel right. One of the supports looked uneven. A bolt sat loose, rattling faintly when the wind picked up. He frowned, making a mental note to mention it to Marta later. "Jose!" He turned just in time to see a small boy break free from the group, chasing a bright red ball that had rolled too close to the scaffolding. "Wait," Jose started. The sound came before the movement. A sharp metallic groan. A shift. A scream. Time fractured. The scaffolding shuddered, metal shrieking as weight redistributed unevenly. One of the vertical bars snapped free, tilting the entire structure toward the yard. The boy froze beneath it. Jose didn't think. There was no calculation, no assessment of risk, no internal debate. His body moved before his mind caught up. He sprinted forward, shouting the child's name as he reached him, wrapping his arms around the small frame, and turning his body instinctively, placing himself between the falling metal and the child. The impact was violent. Steel crashed down, the force slamming into Jose's shoulder and back, driving him to the ground. Pain exploded outward, white-hot and blinding. His breath was ripped from his lungs as something heavy pinned him in place. For a moment, there was nothing but noise. Shouting. Metal clanging. Someone screaming his name. Then hands were pulling. Lifting. The weight shifted. Eased. "Is the kid okay?" Jose gasped, voice raw. "Yes," someone said. "He's okay. He's okay." Jose exhaled once relief flooding through him before the world tilted and went dark at the edges. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet panic. Jose woke slowly, pain blooming in waves that made him grit his teeth. His arm was immobilized. His back throbbed with a deep, aching heat. Machines hummed softly nearby. He blinked, orienting himself. A nurse noticed and approached. "You're awake," she said gently. "You took quite a hit." "The kid?" Jose croaked. "She's fine," the nurse assured him. "Just shaken." Jose closed his eyes. Good. Later, when the room was quieter and the pain medication dulled the edges of his thoughts, he sensed someone standing near the bed. Carolyn. She didn't wear a blazer or polished shoes. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, her face pale beneath the harsh hospital lights. She stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if grounding herself. "You didn't hesitate," she said. Her voice trembled just enough for him to notice. Jose turned his head toward her, wincing. "Didn't have time." She swallowed. "You could have been killed." He shrugged carefully. He couldn't. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unguarded. "I saw it," Carolyn said softly. You didn't look around. You didn't call for help. You just moved. Jose met her gaze. You asked me why I said what I said. Why I felt the need to be cruel. She nodded. I think I know now, he continued. Because I was afraid. Of being small. Of being that kid again, the one no one defended. Carolyn's eyes glistened. And today? She asked. Today I didn't think about myself at all. The words settled between them, unchallenged. Carolyn took a step closer, resting a hand lightly on the edge of the bed. You didn't do this to prove anything. No. You didn't even know anyone was watching. Jose gave a weak smile. That's new for me. She let out a breath she'd been holding and nodded, as if something inside her had finally shifted into place. I judged you, she admitted quietly. He shook his head. You had every reason to. Maybe, she said. But judgment is easy. Understanding is harder. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the room filled with the soft beeping of machines and the distant sounds of the hospital at work. I'm not here as a donor, Carolyn said at last. Or as an executive. Jose looked at her, surprised. I'm here because I was scared, she continued. And because I needed to see you. His chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with something unfamiliar and warm. Thank you for saving him, she said. Jose nodded. I'd do it again. I know. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. Get some rest, she said. The center will be chaotic without you. He smiled faintly. I'll survive. She paused, then added, When you're better, we'll talk. Not if. When. Carolyn left quietly, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Jose stared at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in fragments, metal crashing, a child's frightened eyes. The weight of something heavier than steel lifting from his chest. For the first time in his life, Jose Williams had acted without ego. Without calculation. Without fear. And in doing so, he'd become someone worth worrying about. Not because of what he owned, but because of who he was becoming. Jose left the hospital with a sling on his arm and a stiffness in his back that made every movement deliberate. Pain followed him like a shadow, but it wasn't the kind he wanted to escape. It reminded him that something real had happened, something he hadn't planned, hadn't calculated, hadn't leveraged. He returned to the community center slowly, day by day. No cameras, no announcements, just quiet work and quieter conversations. Carolyn didn't treat him like a hero. She didn't bring up the accident unless he did. She simply made space. It was a Tuesday evening when she finally spoke about the dress. They sat at a small table in the center's kitchen, the day's chaos reduced to the low hum of a refrigerator and the faint smell of tomato sauce. Marta had insisted they eat before leaving, sliding 2 plates toward them without ceremony. Eat, she'd said. Talking is easier with food. Carolyn smiled at that. Now, with the plates between them and the room emptied of everyone else, she folded her napkins slowly, as if deciding something. You never asked, she said. Jose looked up. Asked what? About the dress. He hesitated. I didn't think it was my place. She nodded once, considering him. That's fair. She took a breath, steadying herself. My grandmother's name was Elena. She worked as a housekeeper most of her life. She cleaned offices at night and homes during the day. She saved every dollar she could. Jose listened, unmoving. She owned very little, Carolyn continued, but she believed in keeping what mattered. That dress was one of the few things she ever bought just for herself. She smiled faintly at the memory. She wore it the night she met my grandfather. He was late, nervous, and broke. She said he couldn't stop staring at her like she was something impossible. Carolyn's fingers brushed the edge of her plate. She kept that dress for decades, wore it to weddings, anniversaries, small celebrations. She said it reminded her that dignity didn't come from money. It came from how you carried yourself. Jose felt something tighten in his chest. When she died, Carolyn went on, everyone assumed I'd put it away, that it was too simple, too old, too inconvenient. She looked at him then, eyes clear. But I wear it when I need to remember who I am. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but full. I mocked it, Jose said quietly. I mocked her. Carolyn didn't correct him. I don't expect forgiveness, he added, voice roughening, but I need you to know. His words failed him. For a long moment, he stared at his hands, the sling stark against his suit jacket. Then his shoulders shook once, sharply, like something had snapped inside. I was so afraid of being small, he said, the words tumbling out now. Afraid of being looked down on again. And I thought if I stayed on top, if I laughed first, no one could hurt me. His breath hitched. I became cruel, and I didn't even see it. Carolyn watched him closely. I'm sorry, he said at last. Not because I was exposed, not because I lost control. The apology didn't rush. It didn't defend itself. It didn't ask for absolution. It simply landed. Carolyn exhaled slowly. This, she said, gesturing between them, is why I waited. Jose looked up. Forgiveness, she continued, isn't a response to regret, it's a response to change. She reached across the table and rested her hand briefly over his. The contact was light, grounding. I forgive you, she said. Jose closed his eyes. The release came hard and sudden. Tears he hadn't allowed himself for years burned hot and fast. He bowed his head, breathing through it, letting the moment take him without resistance. When he looked up again, Carolyn was smiling not triumphantly, not cautiously, just kindly. They didn't turn it into something grand after that. They didn't announce anything. They shared meals instead, simple ones. Takeout containers spread across her kitchen counter. Coffee in mismatched mugs. Conversations that wandered from childhood memories to ridiculous failures at the center, his included. You stacked the chairs upside down, she reminded him once, laughing softly. I maintain that they were abstract chairs, he replied. The press, of course, didn't leave them alone. Headlines shifted from outrage to speculation. Billionaire seeks redemption through heiress. Is this love or damage control? Carolyn read them once, rolled her eyes, and closed her laptop. Come on, she said, grabbing her coat. We're wasting a perfectly good evening. They ended up in a park, sitting on a bench with a cardboard box of pizza balanced between them. No security, no entourage, just the city moving around them, unaware and uninterested. A photographer lingered at a distance, clearly disappointed. Carolyn raised her slice in a mock toast. Two being boring. Jose laughed. I've never enjoyed it more. A shout came from across the park, someone calling her name. A reporter, emboldened. Miss Harrison, are you two together? Carolyn didn't flinch. She took a bite of pizza, chewed thoughtfully, then called back. Only in the sense that we're both hungry. The reporter blinked. Jose snorted, unable to help himself. They finished eating in companionable silence, the city lights flickering on one by one. When they stood to leave, Jose noticed something had changed, not dramatically, not loudly. People weren't pointing anymore. They weren't laughing. The ridicule that had once followed him like a storm cloud had thinned, replaced by something quieter. Respect. Not because of who he was with, but because of who he had become. As they walked side by side, Carolyn glanced at him. Tomorrow's busy at the center, she said. Think you're ready? Jose smiled, the expression easy and unguarded. I'll bring bandages. Just in case. She laughed, slipping her hands into her pockets. Behind them, the city kept moving, indifferent to their private reconciliation. And for the first time since the ballroom, Jose felt something settle into place, not power, not control. Peace. The dress had meant everything. And somehow, through humility and pain and quiet change, it had given him something back. The ballroom was different this time. The chandeliers still glittered, the gowns still shimmered, the air still carried the soft music of money moving quietly from hand to hand. But to Jose Williams, the room no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a mirror. Another charity event, another elegant hall, another evening meant to celebrate generosity and influence. On the surface, it looked almost identical to the night that had unraveled him. Only now, he stood beside Carolyn Harrison, not a step ahead, not half a step behind. Beside. He wore a simple dark suit, well-tailored but unremarkable. No statement watch. No calculated posture. His hands rested loosely at his sides, relaxed in a way they never used to be. Carolyn adjusted the microphone on the podium, calm and composed. She wore a dress that was modern this time, clean lines, understated elegance, but Jose knew better than to think the meaning lay in the fabric. Meaning, he'd learned, came from elsewhere. As guests settled into their seats, Jose scanned the room. He recognized faces, some friendly, some cautious, some newly respectful. A few people still whispered, but the tone had shifted. The curiosity was no longer cruel. It was thoughtful. Carolyn glanced at him briefly, her expression warm but focused. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded. "Always." She stepped forward, and the room quieted. "Thank you for being here tonight," Carolyn began, her voice carried with ease, neither commanding nor timid. "Every event like this reminds me that generosity isn't about spectacle, it's about intention." Jose listened, not as a man measuring applause, but as someone genuinely moved by the words. Carolyn spoke about the projects funded over the past year, about classrooms built, about families supported, about quiet wins that never made headlines. She didn't mention names. She didn't draw attention to herself. She never had. As she spoke, Jose remembered the boy he'd been, the one who'd believed success meant never needing anyone. The man he'd become, the one who'd thought dominance was protection. And the person he was still becoming. Carolyn finished to steady applause, stepping back from the podium with a small nod of thanks. As she did, she reached for Jose's hand, not dramatically, not for the cameras. Just naturally. The gesture wasn't about claiming him. It was about choosing him. Jose felt something settle in his chest, deep and sure. This wasn't a fairy tale. They didn't pretend everything was perfect. They still disagreed, still moved at different speeds sometimes, still learned, daily, how to make space for each other without shrinking themselves. Their relationship wasn't rushed. It wasn't polished. It was real. As the evening unfolded, people approached them not to flatter, not to pry, but to speak, to ask questions, to listen. Jose noticed something else, too. No one laughed behind his back. No one looked at him like he was waiting to fall. The ridicule that had once followed him had faded, replaced by something quieter and more lasting. Respect. Not because he stood next to Carolyn Harrison, but because he no longer needed to stand above anyone. Later, as dessert was served and conversations softened into murmurs, Jose found himself standing a few steps back, watching Carolyn speak with a group of volunteers near the stage. She laughed easily, her hands expressive, her presence warm. For a brief moment, he saw her the way the world did. Strong, grounded, unshaken. And then he saw her the way he did. Human, thoughtful, choosing growth every day. He felt no urge to interrupt, no need to assert himself. Pride, yes, but not the brittle kind that demanded recognition. This pride was quiet. Earned. Carolyn eventually caught his eye and smiled, a small, private curve of her lips meant only for him. Jose returned it, heart steady, ego silent. He finally understood what wealth really was. Not money. Not power. Not control. It was character. It was choosing humility when arrogance was easier. It was choosing growth over dominance. It was standing beside someone not because you needed them, but because you respected them. As the night drew to a close, Jose took one last look around the ballroom. The lights dimmed slightly. Guests began to leave. The music softened. The stage stood empty now, but the echo of meaning lingered. Carolyn joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Ready to go?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." They walked out together, not as a spectacle, not as a headline. Just two people moving forward, aware that the future wasn't promised, but chosen. And for the first time in his life, Jose Williams knew exactly what kind of wealth he wanted to build next. Like this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and comment the city you're watching from, because the next story will challenge power, love, and identity even deeper.